Okay, so this presentation is going to look at genetic engineering and aquaculture. Um, so the part of the syllabus we're looking at is part D, mariculture and genetic engineering. And we're also going to incorporate part E, aquaculture. So all of those are covered in this presentation here. And we'll start with genetic engineering. So what is genetic engineering? And basically we're going to look at it from the perspective of environmental science. And therefore the details are a bit less than you'd find in, say, biology. And the steps in genetic engineering are given here, basically. Researchers isolate a gene from an organism, that's the trait they want to impart in the plant. And first of all, the single gene is isolated. Um, we don't really need to go into the details. We just get a bit of plant tissue, uh, blend it up, centrifuge it, get the DNA, and then through, what do we call it, send through electrophoresis, kind of isolate the relevant gene. Uh, Cutting like with ligases and so on, we don't really need to go into. Then we make many copies of the gene and then insert it into a plant. And then seeds from a mature plant are then studied for successful transformation. So I put the steps here. You extract a gene from a donor organism. You isolate the gene. You copy the gene. And then you insert it into a recipient. Uh, for envy, that basically is all you need to say. I went on to say that genetic engineering may be cisgenetic when the genes come from the same species, or transgenetic when it comes from a different species. So genetic engineering basically has several advantages and disadvantages. For example, genetically modified crops are less prone to pests and insecticides since they come with natural pesticides. That's for some genetically modified crops. Sometimes they're engineered for natural pesticides, and hence fewer pesticides are used, which cause a low health risk. And you can think of something such as BT corn in this regard. Uh, a disadvantage on a similar level, these crops contain the DNA of other plants and hence may cause allergic reactions in people. We know, for example, that many people are allergic to, say, peanuts. And if you put a peanut gene into, say, a lettuce, the person might suffer the same allergic reaction. And therefore there's a danger of allergic reactions because of DNA from other plants. Then genetically modified crops use low labor, less irrigation, fewer pesticides, and hence production cost is low since fewer resources are used. And of course, if you're using less labor, less pesticides, and so on, that means productivity has increased. And one of the goals of agriculture is to increase productivity. So by genetically modified crops are often uh, more productive And these crops have low nutritional value, since genetic engineering overlooks nutritional value while focusing on other needs. And of course, that relates to those that are produced for pest resistance and so on. Of course, there are other crops where nutritional value increases. You can think, for example, of golden rice, which has high levels of vitamin A. So the next point, some genetically modified crops are rich in nutrients, and these provide health benefits. But these crops might be resistant to antibiotics due to the genetic modification. And then genetically modified crops produce increased yields, which help feed larger number of populations with a minimum of resources. So again, relating to um, productivity. And a disadvantage, genetically modified crops have increased toxin production levels that are already harmful to humans. So GM crops may contain toxins which are harmful to humans. And there's another thing here, dealing with pros and cons of GM crops and animals. Uh, so GM crops are often have a better taste quality, take less time to ripen, more nutrients, more food, and stress tolerance. Stress tolerance relates to things like such as drought or flooding. And with climate change, it's probably important that crops are stress tolerant. So this is another advantage of GM crops. Another advantage, improved resistance to diseases, pests and herbicides. And of course, new products and growing techniques. You can form entirely new products through genetic engineering. Um, for animals, we have increased resistance to diseases and so on, increased productivity, hardiness, and feed efficiency. And of course, have better yields of meat, eggs, and milk. I suppose with milk, you ought to mention, however, that one thing about genetically modified cows is they continue lactating during pregnancy, and therefore such milk will contain things like estrogen and progesterone. Uh, People say that that's okay because it will be digested in the stomach. But can we take that risk? And of course, another advantage, improved animal health. Another pro is environmental. They have friendly herbicides or insecticides, whereas the normal agrochemicals are harmful. We have conservation of water and soil and so on. Another advantage, um, better natural waste management, because GM crops will produce less waste and more efficient processing. And of course, for society, more food for growing populations. But then there are cons relating to safety, the potential for human health. For example, allergies, the transfer of antibiotic resistance markers. Um, then you have potential environmental impacts, such as the unintended transfer of genes through cross-pollination. So we get what are called super weeds, which may also be resistant to in herbicides. Another con, of course, is that genetically modified crops have intellectual property rights, and therefore, if you want to use them, you've got to pay money. So there's a problem there. And therefore, there's a domination of world food production by a few companies. Some companies will try and uh, control food production because all the genetically modified crops come from them. And this will lead to an increased dependence on industrialized nations by developing countries. So that's another con related to environmental, genetic engineering. It gives some ethical ones, such as violation of natural organisms' intrinsic values, uh, tampering with nature by mixing genes among species, objections to consuming animal genes in plants and vice versa, and stress for animals. So the ethical points, I think some of these are debatable, but if you're asked to state ethical values, ethical problems concerning GM crops and animals, you can mention those. Another con is that labeling is not mandatory in some countries. Um, it's mandatory in some, but not others. And some people think it should be mandatory in all countries. I think this would have gone on to say not mandatory in some countries, example USA. You give an example and then it was cut off. So genetic engineering then. We know GMOs can cross-pollinate with weeds in the environment to produce super weeds. And therefore you need to get super herbicides to get rid of those super weeds. And then you'll need to make increase genetic engineering to make crops more resistant to these super herbicides. And you get a vicious cycle, which is more or less indicated in this cartoon. So you produce a super herbicide to fight off the super weed. And then you'll get a herbicide which more or less destroys all organic matter except the genetically engineered corn or whatever it is. And you'll see the chemical company inspecting the field, making very sure that he has absolutely no physical contact with the uh, ground, and saying there's nothing to worry about. While in fact the farmer is perishing and ends up as a skeleton, and you have the uber weed. So you get a vicious cycle of having to make stronger herbicides, and therefore after that you'll uh, you'll get stronger weeds. So the process will continue. So examples of GMOs: you have golden rice, which contains more beta carotene and therefore more vitamin A. You have flavor saver tomatoes. Um, Tomatoes have a longer shelf life. Or BT corn, corn with an insecticide in it. And you can see the GMO is a lot healthier than the normal corn. And you can have aqua advantage salmon, glow in the dark animals. Other ones mentioning, which will be approved and coming soon, we have uh, apples which don't turn brown. If you use such apples, we couldn't use it for the bio-experiment on enzymatic browning, of course. You have potatoes, reduced bruising and black spot, non-browning, because potatoes also also undergo browning, and low acrylamide. You might know that Irish potatoes, when you fry them or roast them, produce fair quantities of acrylamide, which is carcinogenic. So these potatoes will be healthier. You have field corn. You have insect resistance, herbicide tolerance, and drought tolerance. And the same thing, well, canola you just have herbicide tolerance. Alfalfa, herbicide tolerance. Soybeans, insect resistance and herbicide tolerance. Papaya, which are disease resistant. And cotton, insect resistant or herbicide tolerant. So we have a wide range of crops which are being developed for certain traits. And there's a last one here. We have sweet corn, insect resistance, herbicide tolerance, and summer squash. So that basically covers uh, genetic engineering. And we're also going to look at aquaculture. So what is aquaculture? And aquaculture is farming of aquatic organisms, including fish, mollusks, snails in other words, crustaceans, creations of things like crabs and crayfish and prawns and so on, and aquatic plants. I think the important thing to look at here is aquaculture isn't simply fish, but also mollusks and crustaceans and plants. And farming implies some sort of intervention in the rearing process to enhance production, such as regular stocking, feeding, protection from predators. And farming also implies individual or corporate ownership. Um, Fish farming can be fairly extensive. Um, this here shows a picture of a fish farm. And you can see a large number of bodies of water. So that's quite extensive. And it probably involved a fair amount of capital investment. And this is an example of mariculture, kind of aquaculture in the sea. And all these little enclosures will have fish which are reared for aquaculture, for mariculture. And the sea around is left more or less intact. I suppose the problem here is that it would be very easy to pollute the seawater from these enclosures. So if you look at aquaculture, we first of all need resources. We need land, especially if it's ordinary aquaculture. You need water. You need a fair amount of water. You need seed uh, or small organisms to produce the fish and so on. You need feed, of course, energy, and construction materials. You also need capital and you need labor. And there are effects such as depletion of resources. For the feed, for example, we have habitat loss. If it's aquaculture and we're making ponds and so on land, we're using up land. Food web changes. we're changing the environment, so there'll be changes in the food web and lowered biodiversity. And then, of course, what do we get? We produce fish, shrimp, mussels, seaweed. We also get wastes. You have uneaten food, not all the food will be eaten. And you have fecal and urinary waste. And these can cause eutrophication. And I suppose dealing with the water, which protects the fish, or which the fish find themselves in, after they've finished with it, it has to be either disposed of or treated. Have lowered biodiversity, that's another effect. And in fish, we use a fair amount of antibiotics because the fish are going to be in a high concentration, and therefore we use antibiotics to prevent spread of diseases. Then you have transfer of diseases to new areas and wild stock. The disease-causing organisms in the farm can get out into the wild. And introduction of aliens and genetic pollution. If we rearing fish from outside, say in mariculture, and some of the fish get outside, they become an exotic species and can cause serious problems. But agriculture has several advantages. For instance, it increases food security. It has a high level of productivity. Fish farming is much more productive than animals such as cows and goats and so on. So it has a high level of productivity and increases the range of foods available to people. And remember, food choice is part of food security. The wider the range of foods available, the more food secure a country is. It also increases adaptability of nutrition. Again, because it's a greater availability and according to changing circumstances. So, what happens in aquaculture? Basically, you need a pump tank which contains water, uh, which goes into a fish tank. But before it can go into the fish tank, it needs to be filtered to regulate the amounts of ammonium compounds, nitrite and nitrate, and so on. And at the same time, we need to add oxygen. So we need to aerate the water. So oxygen will come in and carbon dioxide will go out. Then you have a fish tank where you add feed. And then the water needs to be drained where you have mechanical filtration. Wastewater is excreted. And this is a serious problem. What happens to the wastewater? And then some of it can be returned to the pump. That's how depends on how effectively we filter the water. So in this part, in aquaculture, the water can be recycled or even reused in hydroponics. And if we use the water in hydroponics, we call it aquaponics because we're integrating our using the fish farming with hydroponics. So we're integrating aquaculture and hydroponics. It can also be used as a flow, or flow through, or semi-flow through, when wastewater is removed from rivers, flows through a fish farm, and then after treatment is returned to the river. There's a place in Black River which does that, where they rear fish from using water from the Black River, and then finally return the water to the Black River. So it seems a rather sustainable practice, because the water is treated before it's returned, and all the toxins and so on are removed. So an example of flow through aquaculture uses raceways, which are rectangular basins made of concrete, and water is withdrawn from a source, pumped into the raceway, then treated to remove ammonium ions and phosphate, and then the water returned to the source. And then in the semi-flow through, the water is transferred into tanks, and then returned to the water body after the fish are harvested. So it's returned to the fish tank, in other words. And this diagram basically indicates what happens in mariculture, where you have the fish in a cage. And one of the problems with mariculture is fecal matter um, can go into the natural environment. This illustrates a raceway um, where water is treated and then returned to probably a river, and that's mariculture. And that basically finishes today's this presentation.